Good evening, class. This is the lecture on the interwar period, which includes the Roaring Twenties and the Depression 30s. I'm having you guys look at this via the internet rather than have this in class, so that we can catch ourselves back up by the about two class periods that we're behind. I wanted to do this so that we'd have plenty of time for the discussion classes, paper classes, and also at the end of the semester we could have our discussion class about current events, which I think the whole purpose of history is so that you guys can understand current events. So I hope you enjoy this, even though it does not have the same panache, if you will, as seeing me live in person. Hopefully this is not too incredibly boring. I will try and keep it as lively as possible, even though I'm talking to a big plastic box, my laptop. As you can see on the screen here, here's some symbols of the interwar period. If you notice to the right of the screen, you will see an American flapper, which is sort of the stereotype of the new American woman of the 1920s. To the left, you'll see a poster for Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which was about a dysfunctional dystopia of the future, where you have robots and industry basically takes care of every human need, but the problem is mankind is enslaved to that very same technology. And then, of course, right in the center, you will see the swastika of the National Socialist, otherwise known as Nazi Party, which will come into being in the 1920s and 1930s. You can't understand World War II unless you understand the interwar period. So let's get started, and hopefully this will be review. Hopefully we've already discussed this in class, but just in case we had to really cram this in, let's talk about this in greater detail, because World War II, in many historians' view, including my own, is that World War II was just a direct outgrowth of World War I. It was the conditions of the Versailles Treaty that would lead directly to World War II. Now, in 1919, the war was still not over. November of 1918 marked an end to the fighting, but not an official end to the war. So World War I really lasted from 1914 to 1919, not to 1918. Now, in the spring and summer of 1919, the Allied war leaders would meet in Versailles, France. Now, Versailles is the palace right outside of Paris that was the traditional home of the French monarchs. Woodrow Wilson would be one of the first U.S. presidents to actually negotiate a treaty himself, not send an ambassador, but negotiate it himself. He sails to Europe in the spring of 1919 on board a U.S. battleship, the USS Nevada, just in case the Germans want to start the war anew, and meets with the British leader, David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau, who was the president of the French Republic, premier, if in their parlance. Now, Wilson came to Versailles with what you might consider 14 idealistic points. He believed that the Versailles Treaty should be based around 14 points to secure international peace, cooperation, and freedom. He was a progressive. He believed that if only people would follow his formula, World War I would have never happened and future conflict could be avoided. Now, what are some of his 14 points? Well, I'll give you some, but not all of them. They include open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, so no more secret treaties and secret alliances, absolute freedom of navigation on the seas, both in peace and war, the removal of all economic barriers, and establishment of equality of trade between all countries, international disarmament, adjustments of colonial disputes so that The disputes give equal weight to the interest of the colonizer as well as the colonized. National boundaries determined by ethnicity and nationality rather than politics. And then finally, what he called a general association of all nations, a so-called League of Nations. Now, I want to ask you guys, the United States was in the war for just over a year. The United States was in the fighting for just a few months. The United States did not suffer the massive numbers of casualties that both France and Great Britain suffered. The United States actually came out of the war economically healthy. American businesses profited greatly from the war itself. Both France and Great Britain would spend their treasuries, their national wealth, fighting this war. Wealth that had been built up over a century of industrialization, imperialism, and basically being the dominant powers of the Western world. So do you think their leaders really give a flying crap about Wilson's 14 points? Instead, both the leaders of France and Britain want a punitive peace of Germany. They want to force Germany to never be a threat again, but also to make them pay. So in the Versailles Treaty, Wilson gets none of his 14 points except one. He gets the agreement for a League of Nations. However, the other 13 points are basically thrown in the trash of history. Instead, the Versailles Treaty is punitive toward Germany. Germany will be stripped of not only right here, as you can see on the pointer of the screen, Alsace-Lorraine, this territory that Germany had won after the Franco-Prussian War, but they would also lose this territory right here of West Prussia, Posen, this area right here that sometimes is known as Western Silesia. This area was given to the newly reconstituted Poland. Poland had not been in existence in 1914. Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, had been conquered and divided up between Prussia, Austria, and Russia in the 1700s. Poland was remade, and part of that was taken from the Germans. Now, this area that's in orange, this is the industrial heart of Germany, the Rhineland. The Germans technically still own it, but it is demilitarized and is militarily occupied for most of the 1920s by the French and the British. The Americans were there initially, but the U.S. government will pull them out by the early 1920s. So this is Germany after the war. Now, on top of being stripped of territory, Germany is limited to only having a military of 100,000 men. They are forced to turn in things like their machine guns, submachine guns. They're forbidden from having tanks. They can have no air force. They have to cut up all of those biplanes that they built for the war. They can't have any dirigibles. They can't have a navy. In 1919, the German High Seas Fleet is forced to sail to Scapa Flow, which is in northern Scotland, to be interred by the British Navy. Now, this is where it gets kind of funny, because I think the Germans kind of say screw you to the British, because when the German sailors sail their fleet into Scapa Flow, which is the main British naval base in the British Isles, they are supposed to disembark their ships after weighing anchor, or not weighing anchor, but laying anchor, and the British will take them back to Germany. But not wanting to have the British have control over their fleet, there's officers order their men to scuttle their ships. So they plant scuttling charges in the bows of these battleships. These battleships that they had built before and during World War I at extremely, at immense cost to Germany. They will scuttle these ships and clog up the British harbor, and it will take until the 1950s for the ones that are threats to navigation to be fully removed. Even today, there's still German battleships lying on the bottom of that naval base. Now, this is where it gets interesting about the politics of the treaty, because in the Treaty of Versailles, there are two clauses that will directly lead to World War II. The first is that Germany must take full blame for all the death, all the destruction, everything. They must take the blame for the start of the war. They must take the blame for everything that occurred during the war. This is known as the War Guilt Clause. And since Germany is taking all the blame, they owe both the British and the French reparations. They have to pay them money in annual installments. Now let's talk about the losses of World War I that Germany is taking the blame for. What are the lasting effects of this war? Well, there's a lost generation. A lost generation of Germans, English, French, Russians. Let me give you some numbers here to put this in perspective. The United States, which at the time of World War I had a population of about 92 million people. During the war, we would lose 116,000 men. In contrast, the British Empire, let me find the British, hold on. Here we are, the United Kingdom, excluding the British Empire, the United Kingdom numbered 45.5 million. They would lose about 887,000 men. These are just combat deaths. France, which numbered just under 40 million in population, would lose 1,398,000 killed, soldiers killed. This doesn't include civilian deaths. The Germans, which numbered approximately 65 million people, would suffer 2.1 million casualties. Actually, 2.05 million casualties. Now, the other country that we will talk about today, which is the Russian Empire, we really didn't talk that much about them in the war during our class discussion, but we'll talk about it a little bit today. They will come out of the war pretty hurt themselves. Out of a population of about 175 million, they will lose approximately 1.81 million killed in action. So, this war, just of the main combatants, will kill millions. This doesn't include countries like New Zealand, which loses 18,000, or India, which loses approximately 74,000, or Serbia, which loses about 300,000, or Austria, which loses 1.1 million, or the Ottoman Empire, which loses 770,000. So the battle deaths of this war are astronomical. But you have to put this in better context as well. Because this isn't a war fought by the entire population on the front lines. Yes, the entire population has been mobilized during the war for production, rationing, and things like that. But who is on the front line? Who do these numbers represent? Well, they represent men, young men, between the ages of about 16 to 36. In Germany, during the 1920s and 1930s, women in that age group will find it hard to find suitable husbands There's just not enough men around. And those men who survive are figuratively part of a lost generation. These are men who have been scarred by seeing years of death, of living in trenches with rats and corpses, of seeing the world that they had known before the war, that was optimistic, that was forward-thinking, where technology was going to be the salvation of humanity. Well, they saw that view of the world completely and utterly destroyed. And politically, the Europe that they knew in 1914 was gone as well. You know, Britain and France are still there, but Germany is a shadow of itself. You can see the territory that it's lost. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is completely and utterly gone. It is broken up. It falls apart into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Austria, being a little bitty shadow of itself. The Ottoman Empire will collapse and be replaced by a modern Turkey, but all of those territories that it controlled in the Middle East would become mandates of other countries, most notably Britain and France. Now, in areas here along the Western Front, you will see a moonscape that even today, if you go to some parts of northern France, you can still see the craters. You can still see the trench systems. There are some areas of France in which farmers will, well, let's just put it this way, they take their lives in their hand when they plow their fields because the ordnance, the duds that litter the farmland of this area of France is still out there, still being dug up, and some of it is still exploding, destroying plows. And because of the rationing, especially in Germany, but throughout Europe, we talked about how people were starving in Europe during our discussion of World War I. And if you're watching this before we get to it, we'll be discussing this in class. This, of course, brings down people's immunities and allows for a pandemic, the Spanish flu or the swine flu. The reason why it's known as the Spanish flu is not that it originates in Spain. It's because Spanish newspapers that are not controlled by censorship, since Spain is not in the war, you know, Spain is the first to report this flu outbreak. It actually starts in Kansas. It starts from, you know, all of these soldiers who are returning from France, and it sweeps around the world. And because of the poor bookkeeping of some parts of the world, most notably Asia and Africa, we don't know exactly how many people died. On the small side, at least 25 million people, on top of the World War I deaths, died because of the flu. Some estimates go as high as 50 million. Now, of course, World War I brings about the League of Nations, sort of what you might call a pre-UN, a proto-UN. However, we're going to see in our discussion tonight, or today, or whenever you're viewing this, that this League of Nations is going to be impotent. It's not going to be able to do very much. And the technological innovations that should have brought so much hope will also bring panic. Like, for example, World War I will, you know, catapult things like the car from basically the Model T to things like the V8. It will catapult the airplane even further, because when World War I breaks out in 1914, airplanes are just improved versions of the Wright Flyer, basically powered kites. However, by 1919, you will see four-engine bombers. You will see metal planes instead of canvas-covered planes. But also during the war, you will see these planes being used to bomb civilian populations. And during the interwar period, during the 20s and 1930s, military planners will plan to bomb civilian populations. And of course, this will lead people to be very pessimistic about if war ever breaks out again. So these technological innovations, which could have meant, you know, transatlantic air travel, could have meant a more technologically advanced society if we were still in this sort of optimistic mindset of the time period before World War I. World War I will lead to a very pessimistic viewpoint on the part of people. So we see here graphically the effects of the war. We see the total casualties. These are both the killed in action and wounded in action of the major combatants. And we see that America has 364,000 total casualties. And of course, if you put Austria and Germany together, it's 14 million. Some of these men, as I said, are scarred emotionally and mentally. Others will be blinded for the rest of their lives. Others will be permanently scarred, like this guy you see in the picture where his face is blown off. World War I will actually give incentive and give impetus to, well, something that we see in the Kardashians, plastic surgery, but instead of brainless Hollywood nitwits getting Botox and facelifts and boob jobs, plastic surgery started out to give men scarred by war some semblance of normalcy. Like this fellow, they would come up with something that he would hang on his ears to cover the scars on his face so that people would not stare. Germany would pioneer actual usable prostheses. So instead of just having a hook or basically a fake hand that didn't work, the Germans came up with the claws. You've seen these that people used to use. Now we're up to actual hands, but for decades people used these hooks that could be manipulated. The Germans, since they suffered huge numbers of people losing their legs and losing their arms, and these people needed to find work once they left the service, the Germans would pioneer these types of prosthetic devices. So, if we're looking at post-war Europe at the beginning of the 1920s, the European economies are, let's just put it bluntly, they're in the shitter. European economies are, they're burnt out. They have been used up fighting this war, supplying the war material needed to fight the war. And as a result, the United States will take their place. The United States was the world's manufacturer before the war, but before the war, Britain was still the center of world economics. It was still the center of world trade and banking. After World War II, this center will shift to Wall Street, and New York will dominate banking and the money markets of the world up until recently. And France, of course, even though its economy stinks, is still fearful of Germany. And it will use its meager taxes, instead of rebuilding the country like it should have, it will maintain a massive army. An army that will man an increasingly sophisticated trench system along the Western Front. This will become known as the Maginot Line. During the 1920s, the French Parliament will vote on a series of measures raising money for basically the trench system on steroids. And this will commence construction in the very early 1930s and be completed by the mid-1930s. The Maginot Line is basically taking trench warfare to the next level. Instead of earthworks and earthen trenches dug into the ground, these will be replaced with concrete bunkers, several stories tall, all buried underground. The only thing above ground will be observation points, machine gun bunkers, and even battleship-style artillery turrets. Now, Britain will withdraw from the continent, leaving the defense of the continent to the French, because Britain during the war will have to basically siphon and steal all of its troops from the various points of its far-flung empire. And with a sick economy in the 1920s, we'll basically have to deal with the result of not having the troops on the ground to keep these people in check. For example, it's during the 1920s that the Irish will rebel, and the lower two-thirds of Ireland will gain their freedom from the British Empire. It's also during the 1920s that Mahatma Gandhi will start his Indian National Congress, seeking First, to get some kind of leniency from British forces, some form of self-rule within the British Commonwealth, and then finally seeking direct Indian independence. Now, all of those countries that we talked about in Eastern Europe, like Poland, for example, these countries have either been, they've all been oppressed and ruled by outside powers, whether it be in the Austrian Empire or in the Polish case, they were pretty much split between Germany and Russia. These people have no idea, no history, no modern history in self-rule. Many of these people have been part of an empire since the 1600s. The Polish, of course, being part of the British and Russian Empire since the 1700s. So for over a century, these people have not been able to rule themselves. And as a result, they tend to shift toward authoritarian regimes. In the 1920s and in the 1930s, Poland, for example, will become ruled by a succession of military generals. Hungary and Bulgaria will be theoretically monarchies, but ruled by the military as well. The only new country to come out of World War I that will have a healthy democracy is Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia will be a fairly healthy democratic republic. It will be a friend to France and Britain. It will be sort of a lone beacon in this very turbulent part of Europe. And as a result, since it's sort of out there on its own, the Czechs will take it upon themselves to build a very modern military and build their own defensive line in the northern part of their country, right up against the German border. Now, the reason why I'm giving you these details of Czechoslovakia is the fate of Czechoslovakia will directly lead to World War II. Now, to understand World War II, of course, we have to understand Germany. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II will abdicate even before the armistice in November of 1911 or 1918. This leaves a provisional liberal government to sign the treaty. Well, this doesn't bode well for them because they're basically stained with the dishonor of signing this punitive peace agreement. Because one thing I should point out to you guys is when this peace treaty is being negotiated in Versailles in 1919, the Germans are not even allowed in the room. They're kept out in the foyer. And they're basically told to come in, sign the treaty, or we start shooting again. And so this provisional government is forced to sign a treaty that it didn't even help make. So between 1919 and 1923, Germany is racked by violence. On November 7, 1918, German communists in Bavaria will try and secede from Germany and declare the Bavarian Soviet Republic. They do so in November of 1918 because this is the first year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Now you're going, well, I thought that was the October Revolution. Well, the reason why the October Revolution happens in November is because the Cyrillic calendar that the Russians use is not the same as the calendar that Western Europe and the United States used at the time. So it actually happened November 7th, whereas according to the Russian calendar it happens the last week in October. But we'll talk about that later in this lecture as well. So these German communists try and set up a Soviet-style republic in Germany, in the southern province of Bavaria. Now, this provisional government of Germany, well, they don't have the manpower to force them back. Remember, their military is limited to only 100,000 men, and they're tasked with defending the borders of all of Germany. And Germany at this time is experiencing political and economic turmoil all over Germany, not just in Bavaria. So the provisional government makes, to put it bluntly, they make a deal with the devil. they make a deal with a group called the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps are paramilitary gangs. They're street gangs that have no connection with the government. The Freikorps are made up of former soldiers, they're German veterans. These are men that were once part of a proud military that numbered several million strong, and because of the Versailles Treaty, both officers and enlisted alike have been drummed out of the service, and they're coming back to a Germany where the economy cannot support this massive influx of men. They can't. They're jobless. So they form these Freikorps, which means literally in German free corps or free units. And they arm themselves with military-style weapons because many of these former officers still have connections with those officers still running the armories. And so the provisional government basically makes a deal with these Freikorps units saying if they would bring back Bavaria, put down this communist revolt, the government would look the other way. And so the Freikorps helped the German military put down the Bavarian communist revolt. However, I said this was a deal with the devil, because in March of 1920, just over a year from the Bavarian Soviet Republic, a number of Freikorps units will seize Berlin under the leadership of Wolfgang Kapp, a Freikorps leader and right-wing journalist. So imagine this. Just as the provisional government is sitting down in Berlin to draft a new constitution, their capital is seized by street gangs, and the government is forced to flee to Weimar, Germany, which is in the center of Germany. It's in Weimar where they finally hammer out and pass the new constitution. If you're a German, how much trust do you have in the government? I mean, how much trust would you have in the United States government if the local street gangs in D.C. are able to seize the capital and force the government to, say, Baltimore? You wouldn't have very much, would you? No, you wouldn't. And this is why Weimar Germany, or interwar Germany in the 1920s, is known as Weimar Germany, because their constitution was signed in Weimar. The government doesn't stay there. It goes back to Berlin. But the constitution is signed there in Weimar Germany. Now, the German military is able to put down the Freikorps rebellion, the Kapp Putsch as it's known. However, this will sort of highlight the instability of Germany at this time. Now, this instability is made worse by the fact that the German mark is hyperinflating during this time period. The Germans have only one recourse in order to keep their economy going and pay the reparations. Print money. Just print it. And of course, the more you print, the more worthless it is. And so the German economy is, well, it's bad. Let's just say that. It's bad. However, this will change in 1923. In 1923, as part of the new government, a fellow by the name of Gustav Stresemann is elected as Chancellor of the new Weimar Republic. Now, Stresemann comes with a plan. Stresemann will seek out guaranteed loans from the United States. He will do so through a U.S. Senator by the name of Charles Dawes. So this is often known as the Dawes Plan. How does this work? Well, it's simple. U.S. banks, being guaranteed by the U.S. government, will loan Germany money. Germany will use this money to rebuild its economy and pay off the reparations to the Allies. The Allies will adjust and lower their reparations as part of this because the United States government uses its, well, to put it bluntly, its loans that the Allies are indebted to the U.S. with as leverage. In exchange, the Germans are able to make consistent payments on the reparations. So stable payments in exchange for a lower rate. Now, this Dawes Plan will allow the German economy to recover. It will allow it to get going. one thing you need to remember, this is an economy based on debt, because it's based on American money, American loans coming to Germany so that they can keep their economy going. They can also pay off the reparations to the Allies, and then the Allies in turn can turn around and pay off their loans that they took out from the U.S. for World War I. But in the short term, the Germans don't care. It's a relief from the political instability and the economic chaos of the early 1920s. So in the mid and late 1920s, Germany has what you might call a cultural revival. Now, this revival is not reviving the traditional German culture of before World War I. Instead, this is an avant-garde culture, an artistic culture, a more free culture, but it's a culture that will, well, smack many Germans in the face. Because on the one hand, you have innovative street theater, you have cabaret theater, you have women imitating American women of the 1920s, the flapper, and we'll talk about the flapper in America more here in a minute, but to put it bluntly, women are more assertive. They smoke, they drink, they go out on their own. And in Germany, in certain areas, mainly in places like Berlin and Cologne, women will, well, be more promiscuous. They will be more sexual and sensual. And in many parts of this Weimar culture, both men and women will hint at or even openly display homosexuality. Now, this amorality of Weimar culture will offend many traditional Germans. For example, some artists that are very popular in Weimar Germany will be, they will be hit with fines for blasphemy or defaming the military. The military, of course, before World War I was seen as a pillar of German society, and when German artists start to make fun of them in comedic sketches or in artwork, many Germans find this to be obscene. Now, what's going on in Germany is not really something that radical, because in the United States we also see cultural change, just not to the same degree. America is business as usual after Versailles, because the business as usual politics of Versailles basically makes Americans believe that we don't need to be part of Europe. Instead, we just need to carry on our own business and profit from our own endeavors. But so in the 1920s, Americans will revert to dealing with themselves, working on their own problems, and also revising and changing our own culture. Because America's new culture will be very much technologically driven. World War I will sort of give a jump start to certain technologies which will come to dominate the 1920s. One of them, of course, is radio. Radio and movies. Now, radio before World War I was pretty much in its infancy. There was no such thing as voice radio for the most part in the pre-war time. Most radio communication was done using Morse code. Now, in the early 1920s, voice radio is introduced. And in the early 1920s, you see the proliferation of what I like to call mom-and-pop radio stations. For example, in New York City, the various ethnic neighborhoods might have their own short-range radio station. So you'll have in the Italian ghetto of New York, Italian neighborhoods, you'll have a radio, and it's in Italian. In the Irish neighborhoods, you might have a radio station that plays Irish music. And this is something that is, on the one hand, very interesting and very, very free, because anybody can set up a radio station early on. But it also runs to several problems, namely in the fact that since there is no regulations on radios to begin with, people can transmit on the same frequency, which leads to basically noise. This will give rise to the Federal Communications Commission, which is passed in the which is created by Congress, passed by Congress in the mid-1920s. This will, of course, lay the groundwork for government licensing for radio stations. Now, one of the outcomes of government licensing is that you have to pay for the license, and of course the license isn't cheap. And many of these mom and pop radio stations can't afford it. This is combined with the fact that radio is very popular in the 1920s. As you can see here, you see young boys right here listening to radio, and it was often quite common for young boys and girls to build their own sets. So there's a market for radio, and big business and investors get involved, and they found several companies that you might recognize. These companies like the Columbia Broadcasting Stations, the National Broadcasting System, or not National Broadcasting Company, NBC, RKO, the American Broadcasting Company, ABC. So ABC, NBC, CBS, they didn't start out with TV, they started out instead with radio. And these large corporate entities, they can afford the license. So the days of the mom and pop small station is numbered. The best illustration of the small sort of local radio station is in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where you see the local politician going and transmitting, campaigning via radio, and he says, "I'm a communicating. This is modern." Well, that right there will disappear by the 1930s, and of course today radio is dominated by just a few corporate entities. Now, this of course has more than just an economic effect. It has a social and cultural effect as well. Because if you are a large corporate station, do you want to just have a bunch of little radio stations with their own individual formats and their own playlist? No. You want to standardize it so that you can produce a common product, a standardized product in, say, New York, and that's why radio is based mainly out of New York. You want a common product that you can transmit via a large transmitter to be rebroadcast via your subsidiaries, your license holders, to their local audiences. Now the problem arises is that what do you play? What do you put on the station? Of course, it would have to be in English. So no more ethnic channels that are transmitted in Yiddish or Italian or the accent of the Irish. But even American English needs to be English that will draw a large audience to your stations. You don't want somebody who sounds like they're from the Deep South, because they will not attract people from, say, the Midwest or the New England. You don't want somebody that sounds like they're from New York, because the Southerners won't listen to the Yankees. What you need is an accentless accent. And so these radio pioneers, these corporate pioneers, will choose an accent from America's Midwest, namely around Kansas City. That's why people like Paul Harvey and even Rush Limbaugh are from this area, because they don't have an accent, or it's an accent that isn't pronounced. And so, as young boys and girls grow up listening to radio, not just news stations, not just music, but also entertainment, Little Orphan Annie, The Lone Ranger, they will listen to them being described to them, because this, radio is just sound. You have to describe the action. You're going to listen to the narrator And the narrator is going to be this accentless accent. And so Americans will start to learn to speak with a different tongue. Because today, young Americans don't learn their speech from their parents and their immediate surroundings like they used to. They still pick up how they talk from their parents, but they also pick it up from school, but they also pick it up from TV, movies, and back then it was radio. So America becomes more homogenized in terms of our accent, but also our cultural references, because we are now listening to the same programs and the same news broadcast. This can also be said of a new entertainment format, and this, of course, is film. Film will come into its own in the 1920s, starting out with silent features like the comedies of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, to the dramas of I forget the actor's name. Hold on a minute. This is one of the cool things about having a computer right next door to you. Let's see here. Silent film stars. See, I'm doing what you guys do with your iPhones. I think it's Rudolph Valentino. Yes, to the heartthrob of Rudolph Valentino. But in the late 1920s, the silent films will give way to what was known as the talkies. And now with sound, people will learn how to speak from, classic actors of the 1930s. An interesting case in point is Rudolph Valentino, who was probably one of the most famous actors in the early 1920s, would fade into obscurity in the late 20s and 30s, because while he looked sexy and looked the part visually, he spoke with a high voice, which American women did not find sexy. Now, the 1920s will also be a technologically driven decade for Americans, because post-war America will be in a society of plenty. Those factories that had expanded for war production would turn to producing everything from Model Ts and radios, to kitchen stoves, to consumer goods, to clothing. And Americans would be able to buy this because consumer credit, the interest on that, was purposely kept cheap by the Federal Reserve. So Americans will be able to buy things on credit, buy cars on credit through, say, Ford and GM, take out loans from banks, such as home loans, and buy new houses. So construction is expanded during this time period. If you guys drive around old Maryville, you will notice around Maryville High School, for example, these old bungalow-style houses. Many of these were built during the 1920s. These are the types of small homes that were built by people seeking to have a nice house of their own. But all of this is what most people do not remember about the 1920s. Instead, they think about the Roaring Twenties as a time period of social liberalism, of bootlegging and prohibition, of suffragists, of mob violence, and just, basically, a lot of stuff going on. Now, the 1920s did roar, and the Roaring Twenties were partly due to the social change away from Victorian ideals and also of prohibition. So, culturally, how did America change? What were the Victorian ideals of the pre-World War I era? Well, Victorian ideals were one of modesty, of frugality, of saving oneself for marriage. Women were expected to wear multi-layered dresses and always wear sleeves that came down to their ankles, always wear dresses that came, or sleeves that came down to their wrist, I should say, and wear dresses that came down to their ankles. They weren't supposed to wear anything that showed their neck. No skin, especially no cleavage. And even men. The dress shirts of the age were shirts that were always buttoned up like this. High collars. Men didn't wear short sleeve shirts because that would be considered immodest and improper as well. Women were supposed to stay in the home. And if they were to leave, they were supposed to be with a male escort. This, of course, would change in the 1920s. Of course, men would get away from the high collar shirt and, of course, start wearing short sleeves. But the biggest change is, of course, women. As you can see here in this picture, this is a stereotypical flapper. Oh, my Lord, look at this. You can see skin. You can see the nape of her neck right here. You can see her shoulder. You can see above her ankle. Oh my God, I'm about to pass out. Now, it's not just the dress of the flapper with her short hair, her makeup that goes beyond what would have been allowable in the Victorian period, her skimpy dress by Victorian standards, but it was also her attitudes. Flappers of the 1920s, these are women who went to bars and speakeasies on their own. They caroused without male escorts, and they were more sexually promiscuous than their mothers were. Now, if you're going to go to a bar, you're going to need liquor. However, liquor has been illegal since 1919. Actually, it starts in 1917. In December of 1917, the U.S. Senate will pass what is known as the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act is the law that gets national prohibition going. And this will be cemented when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified in January of 1919. So while the troops are away, while these young men are on the front line, the people back home have outlawed drinking. However, when American troops come home and the other young men and the women of their generation start to grow up in the 1920s, they are of a different generation than those that had just got done passing prohibition. These are young men and women who believe it's their right to go out and have a good time, especially since they've turned away from the reform movements of the progressive era, that era before World War I. Instead, Americans are looking more toward having fun, bettering themselves. It's more individualistic and more self-centered in a lot of ways. And so these young people are willing to break the law, because the interesting thing about the Volstead Act is that it makes illegal the sale or production of alcohol. It does not make it illegal to actually drink it. So you can drink it all day and not be violating federal law. It's the makers and the sellers who are breaking laws. And that's why the 1920s is the era of the bootleggers, the rum runners, and the mob. Because the only people willing to produce and sell this stuff are the people willing to break the law, people willing to face jail time. I mean, notable individuals like Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, will make a family fortune running rum from Canada to Massachusetts. Joseph Kennedy was a noted ship owner and, of course, would use those assets to make an illicit fortune. Of course, here in East Tennessee, people were noted, of course, for making white lightning or moonshine. However, the main beneficiaries of prohibition is organized crime. There was no such thing as organized crime before prohibition. Before prohibition, these gangs that would become the mob were a very diverse group, dominating small little fiefdoms in, say, New York or New Jersey. It is prohibition that allows for a nationwide criminal enterprise to emerge because prohibition was so profitable. A good case and study of this is the career of Al Capone. Al Capone was a low-level enforcer for the Italian families of New York. He was sent out to Chicago to basically manage the transport of illicit liquor from Canada through Chicago into the American Midwest. Capone would shake off the control of these families in New York, become his own man, come to dominate not only Chicago, but the areas around Chicago. He would have enough money to buy off politicians, buy off police, buy off judges, because his annual income was estimated as close to $60 million from this enterprise. And so, America was basically bathing in illicit liquor. And so the only problem with having liquor provided by criminals is that criminals can't have the protection of the law. If somebody steals my shipment of illegal booze coming from Canada, I can't go to the local authorities and say, hey, these people stole my booze, because I'm the one that's going to be put into jail. So one reason why the mob succeeds is not only are they willing to break the law, but they're willing to do so with the violence necessary to defend their enterprise, their business from other people just like them. Now, another thing that shows the change in ideals during this time is the suffrage movement finally comes to a climax. American women had been fighting for suffrage, which is the right to vote, starting in about 1848. Women had been campaigning and meeting resistance up until this time. However, women actually benefited from America's role in World War I because they had two arguments that they could use in the 1920s to win the right to vote. The first is that women argued, hey, we took part in this war, we helped win it, we should have the right to vote. That was argument number one. The second argument is, this war sucked. America got pulled into it by a consortium of bankers and war profiteers, basically people making war ammunition and guns and stuff like that. If women had had the right to vote, if women had had the right to basically threaten politicians with de-election, women would have kept us out of the war. And both of these arguments actually worked, because in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. And of course, this grants women the right to vote. Now, the party that was the 1920s will come to a screeching halt in October of 1929. As you can see on this graph at the very top of the screen, Black Tuesday is where the stock market in one day loses close to a third of its value. And it marks a continuing trend of the stock market falling from 1929 all the way down to its low in 1932. Now, this graph should not be taken alone, because if you look at graphs of employment, earnings, business profits, they all follow this same general trend, crashing in 1929 and falling to an abysmal low in 1932. Now, why did the Great Depression happen when it did? Why did Black Tuesday occur when it did? Well, Black Tuesday is the product of a debt-ridden, it's a product of bad debt, overproduction, and easy money. During the 1920s, America had low interest rates. Americans in general wanted to come back from World War I and enjoy the productive efforts of peace. So the combination of Americans wanting new life, wanting these new technologies, like radio, for example, and new cars, combined with an ease of getting a loan, basically, hey, I'm not getting charged a lot of interest, meant that Americans went hog wild. They used their credit cards before credit cards were around. Americans went into debt, taking out bank loans to buy homes, to buy cars. They used store credit to buy things like radios and other store goods, clothing. They even used credit to play the stock market, because with the economy booming the way it is, the stock market shot up during the 1920s. As you can see, just between 1927 and 1929, it almost doubled. And during this time period, many Americans who had never before, Americans as individuals rarely ever played the stock market before this time period. Now men and women who had never played the stock market and didn't know anything about the stock market started to invest in the stock market. And instead of just using their own money to buy stocks, they would take out loans, or they would do something called buying on margin. Buying on margin is literally going to a stock dealer, a stockbroker, and saying, I've got 10% of what this stock you're selling it for. I'll pay you this 10%, and I will pay you the rest later at interest. The assumption is the stock is going to go up faster than the interest. I'll be able to use the profits from the stock sale to pay off the interest, plus a little extra on the side for me. So Americans are in debt up to our necks. And it's not just Americans who are in debt. The French and the British are still in debt to us for World War I. The Germans are in debt for us through the Dawes Plan. So what happens in 1929 that causes this to just come to a screeching halt? Well, corporations start to report bad earnings. By 1929, actually by 1928, more things being produced in American factories are being warehoused, stored, than are being sold. America has already bought up everything that it can buy up. We've already sort of reached that limit, that plateau of what Americans can absorb, what they're willing to buy. However, businesses have banked on this buying to continue, and so they continue to produce. However, by 1929, business has to report, we're not making any profits anymore. We're not making sales. They start the initial layoffs of workers because they're not selling anything. And of course, these kinds of reports, even today, cause stock prices to drop. These reports are so bad in 1929 that the stock market plunges. Now, today, if the stock market crashes too far, if it loses too many points, it automatically closes. It does this to safeguard against what happened in 1929. Because the initial drop, the initial reports, did not cause this huge drop you see here on the screen. Whoops, let me go back. This initial drop. It's the panic that sets in after people see, oh my God, the stock market's going down. We need to get out. That panic sets in and causes the stocks to collapse. Now, when the stocks collapse, this sends shockwaves through all the other financial markets, not just in the United States, but around the world. When financial markets suffer such a shock like this, banks get really wary of loaning money. They start to call the loans. Now, how do you call a loan? You just can't go and say, we want all the money back. No, how a bank calls a loan is they start jacking up interest rates to give you incentive to pay it back as fast as you can. Because if you don't, they're going to jack it up even further. So America's financial institutions start raising interest rates on those people who took out loans for cars and houses and stocks. They quit giving loans to countries like Germany. And if Germany doesn't have money, they can't pay the reparations. If they can't pay the reparations, then the French and the British can't pay their debt to us. So this flow of money, even if it is debt, it's still the flow of money that's going between the United States, Germany, the Allies, and back to the United States that keeps the lifeblood of commerce going, even though it's a debt-based lifeblood, ceases to flow. So that, at the macro level, is breaking down. At the micro level, people are losing their homes. They're being foreclosed upon. This is also made doubly worse by many of these people are losing their jobs because the very businesses that can no longer sell the products are laying off their workers. So by 1932, in the United States, for example, 25% of Americans are completely out of work. A similar number are homeless. Hobos and transients. Transientism becomes commonplace. Now, the 25% kind of hides the truth because that's not including those people that are underemployed, those people who are working part-time because they can't find a full-time job. And what does this lead to? It leads to political chaos. In the United States, this is the one time in the early 1930s that Americans start to turn toward fringe political organizations. But Americans turning toward fringe organizations is somewhat tamer than what we see overseas. Overseas, we see the governments of France and Great Britain, France in particular, become more closed. We see the Weimar Republic, the government there, almost collapse. We see these various international governments closing off their trade, their systems, their markets from anybody else, hoping to try and insulate themselves from this collapsing markets, only to have these closed trading systems contribute to their own Great Depression. And as we will see, this will give rise to new economic policies to try and combat the Great Depression. In the United States, we see these policies that are known as Keynesian economics. They're based on the economic theories of the English economist John Maynard Keynes. We see these in FDR's New Deal. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins the presidency in 1932. He wins with the promise of vigorous action. Now, here's the interesting thing. None of FDR's advisors, known as the New Dealers, could tell the American public what this action was going to be. And early on, these programs are often conflicting and contradictory. Many historians and economists argue today that the New Deal really did not get the United States out of the Depression. This is still a hot topic issue, so I'm not going to go into great detail about it because on the one side you have some historians and economists who argue that it did get us out of the Depression because it boosted the economy. It did what Keynes said it would do, which was it pumped money into the economy and allowed consumers, the ability to buy products. That's Keynesianism boiled down. You basically provide people money through government stipends or public jobs. They have money. They can then buy stuff, and then in buying stuff, they stimulate the economy. However, some other economists and historians argue that the taxes and the national deficits and the depreciation of the American money supply offsets any benefits of Keynesianism, thus leading to what one economist I've read called mere life support, not really recovery, just keeping the economy barely alive. I personally believe the latter, and I think that the U.S. economy will not recover until the massive spending of World War II, but more importantly, the savings accrued during the Great Depression and World War II are let go by a generation that has been tempered by the mistakes of the generation of the 1920s, not wanting to make the same mistakes of malinvestment and spending too much and going into too much debt, but at the same time, people who have the assets willing to buy products and keep the economy going. But one thing I will give the New Deal credit for, and I think almost every historian will give FDR credit for this, is it gave Americans hope Because in 1932, FDR and his New Dealers came promising vigorous action. Vigorous action on their part, on their account, to help out the American public. And so one reason why the American public, for the most part, does not turn toward fringe political movements is because they think the system is working. They're not willing to overthrow the system because the system is actually doing what it should. The public officials are trying to solve the problem and help out the American public. It gave Americans hope. This cannot be said of the systems in Europe, especially in Germany. Because in Europe, fascism becomes a popular political movement. Now, fascism is it's a political movement, a political ideology that's hard to really nail down because fascism expresses itself in different ways in different countries. However, it is any movement or ideology that favors dictatorial government, centralized control of private enterprise, and a repression of all opposition. And when I say repression of all opposition, fascists are not just looking for repression of political opposition, but also any alternative source of authority. And we'll talk about how fascism becomes totalitarianistic here in a minute. Now, fascism in Europe was often expressed as expansionistic and ultra-nationalistic. Fascism, unlike communism, stresses the power of the state in defending the nation. And when I say nation, I'm not talking about the country. I'm talking about the people. Now, in fascism, the people tend to be one ethnic or national group. All other groups, even if they're living in that country, even if they're citizens of that country, are seen as enemies. Now, this attracts the favor of many traditional conservatives in Europe, especially in Germany, because the Germans had just experienced Weimar culture, and many traditional Germans saw Weimar culture as an abomination. They saw it as a defamation of their culture, and fascism promised to wipe away this Weimar culture because it was so non-German, if you will. Now, while fascism stands against liberal governments like liberal free market republics and democracies, they also stand against the traditional left, which is socialism and communism. The weird irony of German fascism is it's called National Socialism for a reason. Hitler just didn't pick that name just because he liked it. It is trying to take the idea of state-run and state-managed business, like in corporatism, and combine it with the national identity, the ethnic identity, as expressed in fascism. So how does Germany become fascist? Well, first and foremost, the effects of the Treaty of Versailles. Again, I told you these would be important. Here we are again. Germany felt that it got the raw end of the deal, that it did not deserve. Germans did not think they deserved the punitive peace of Versailles. In 1929, the Great Depression destroys the German economy of the Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation wipes out the savings of the middle class. It makes the earnings of both the working class and the middle class worthless. And at the same time, the political parties of Germany, and Germany has multiple political parties, they appeared not able to do anything because they were too busy blaming each other. Into this void steps this man. This, of course, is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is, well, he is an ironic and interesting historical figure because Hitler got his start as part because of the Weimar government. In the immediate post-war period, about 1919-1920, the weak Weimar government hired veterans, soldiers, to spy on what it considered fringe political groups. As you remember, they just got done fighting off the Bavarian Soviet Republic and the Kapp Putsch. They wanted to keep tabs on what was going on. And so Hitler was tasked with infiltrating a small little radical group called the National Socialist Party. Actually, it was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. However, Hitler liked what he heard. And even though he was a paid spy, he joined this Nazi party, as it would become known, rose through its ranks, and came to lead it. In November of 1923, Hitler would lead what was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, an attempt to seize Bavaria, to seize control of the government of Lower Germany. He did so because just a year beforehand, another fascist, a fellow by the name of Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist, had successfully marched his fascist party of Italy to Rome, intimidated the other political parties of Rome into allowing the Italian fascist party into their parliament, into their legislature, where the Italian fascists would come to dominate it shortly thereafter. So Hitler wanted to try the same thing. Well, in 1923, he fails, and he is sentenced to 9 years in jail. No, take that back, 5 years in jail. He spends 9 months in jail instead. During this time period, he writes his magna opus, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf is basically Hitler's political viewpoint and political manifesto boiled down for every German to read. Now, I've read Mein Kampf, and you've got to probably be in the mindset of a Nazi to fully understand it, because it's the rantings of I won't call him a madman, but it's just rantings. However, this is one of the #1 sellers not only in Germany, but it's translated into English and French, and as late as 1937, it's in the top 10 bestsellers in the United States. By 1932, Hitler's learned from his mistakes of the Beer Hall Putsch. Instead of trying to force his way into politics, he reconstructs the Nazi Party into a legitimate political party, running for office. And he campaigns vigorously throughout the late 1920s and 1930s. Of course, the Great Depression helps the Nazis immensely because they are the only party that appear to have any plan for solving the Great Depression. By 1932, the Nazi Party wins over 37% of the vote. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, there are multiple parties, so there are more than just 2 parties in the Nazi parliament, in the Bundestag. So 37% gives Hitler's Nazis a majority. And in 1933, he becomes chancellor. The only thing that really stands in Hitler's way is that under the Weimar Constitution, the chancellor is the head of the German parliament, but not the head of state. The head of state is the aging president, Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg was one of the commanding generals, one of the more successful commanding generals and highly respected general of the German military. Hindenburg hates Hitler. He calls him that damn Bavarian corporal, because Hindenburg, his real name is Paul von Hindenburg, is noble. He's from a different social class. He thinks Hitler is a fringe kook, and while he is president, he effectively blocks the Nazis' political program. However, in 1935, after Hindenburg's death, the Nazi-dominated parliament will pass a resolution combining the chancellor and the presidency into one political position. Der Führer, the leader. Hitler now has absolute power. So what are Hitler's policies? Well, he runs Germany as if it's constantly in a state of emergency because, according to Nazi ideology, it is always under threat, both from outside, from the victorious Allies, and from the Bolsheviks in the East, but also internal threat, the Jews. He also outlaws all the other political parties. So by 1937, the Nazi Party is the only political party. He also centralizes all functions underneath the Nazi Party and the state, dominated by the Nazi Party. So your local police force, like the Maryville and Alcoa PD, would not report to their constituents here in Blount County, but instead would report to Berlin. And all institutions, including trade unions that were not connected with the Nazi Party, were outlawed. So unless you were part of the Nazi trade unions, you couldn't be part of a union. Also, the Boy Scouts are banned and replaced with a Nazi counterpart, the Hitler Youth. And as I said before, the Nazis take control of both the military and the police force. So how would you describe Germany during this time period? Well, it is a paranoid society. It is a society where the Nazis, they feed on Germans' fear of outside enemies and the enemies within. And of course, the Nazis have been constructing and building this paranoia through their effective use of propaganda and their control of the press. So by the mid-1930s, Germans fear the Jewish conspiracy. They fear that the superior Aryan race was being destroyed by inferior groups within German society. And so, in order to destroy these things and protect the racially valuable people of Germany, those people that are deemed unfit, like those with mental or physical handicaps, are sterilized. If they if they already are pregnant, they're forcibly aborted. Later on, these people will be some of the first sent to the concentration camps. It's not just the Jews who are exterminated. The Jews will have to endure organized oppression. In 1935, the Nazi Party will pass what becomes known as the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws are this broad-ranging set of laws aimed at those that are considered racially subhuman, most notably those of Jewish descent. For example, if you are Jewish, you cannot marry anybody who is German. And of course, if you're a German, you cannot marry anybody who is Jewish. Jews are outlawed from serving in government. They will have their business licenses and other licenses revoked, because one of the things about the Nazi state is they basically control aspects of society by licensing them. If you don't hold a license to own a business or sell food or even be an organized church, then you are doing something illegal. And so the Jews literally become non-people in Germany. People who are not protected by the law, whose assets are not protected. This is well before they're shipped off to extermination camps in the East. Because the Nazi dominated Nazi Germany is the best illustration of what historians call a totalitarian state. So what is a totalitarian state? Well, a totalitarian state is one dominated by an ideology where there is an enemy. There's always an enemy in a totalitarian state, because there needs to be an enemy for the central leader, or trendy group, as I call them, to come forward and protect the state, the nation from. So this messianic leader or group will come forth with an alternative, a utopian society where the enemy of the society will be done away with and an ideal community will be built. In order to build this ideal community means that the party must dominate society. And so this mass party or group, you have to be a member of them in order to function in society. So if you want to have a business license, if you want to be a government official, regardless of how low-ranking you are, if you want to serve in the military as an officer, if you want to do anything, you must be a member of the party. A good case in point in this is if you remember the first couple of minutes of Schindler's List. Liam Neeson's character, Oskar Schindler, is getting ready. He's lying out all of his clothes and all the things that he's getting ready to do because he's going to get dressed to the nines, fill his pockets full of money so that he can go and bribe government officials in order to get business deals, to make money. Oskar Schindler wasn't a Nazi, but the last thing that he put on in that scene in his lapel is his little Nazi party pin, because Oskar Schindler was a card-carrying Nazi. When I say card-carrying, he had the card, he had the pin, but up here in his head, no, he was not a Nazi, but he had to be one in order to be in the in crowd. So in a totalitarian state, the party dominating the government has control of or co-ops, so either direct control or regulates the economy and all aspects of business. They dominate the media and communications. They control religion, clubs, and other associations, because you cannot have an independent association because that's an alternative source of authority, and totalitarians cannot stand that. And finally, they have the control of force. They must dominate the military. They must dominate the police force. And just as importantly, they must ban any individual means of resistance. So any club that could offer organized resistance must be done away with or co-opted, like the American Legion. And the people must be disarmed. This is the first thing that Hitler does upon assuming his position as the Fuhrer. He issues an edict where people had to turn in their private guns. Because you don't want the people able to resist. You don't want the people able to organize. You don't want the people able to communicate. You don't want the people able to live by normal business transactions without the control of the state. The state has to be there, because a totalitarian does not just want to keep somebody in their place, to keep them from being politically active. A totalitarian wants to control all aspects of society, because in the end, a totalitarian wants to control society, wants to control its development, and reform society in its ideological image. Now, there's another totalitarian state that is developing during the 1920s and 1930s. And this, of course, is the Soviet Union. So let's talk about the origins of Soviet totalitarianism. Before World War I, Russia was a monarchy, an absolute monarchy. So there was no parliament, there was no other alternative source of authority, there was no representative bodies. There was the Tsar. Here we have a picture of Tsar Nicholas II. Now, Tsar Nicholas II was a true believer in the autocracy of Russia. He believed that all power came through the Tsar from God himself. And so when Russia enters World War I, Tsar Nicholas II does so without regard to his own army, because Russia is ill prepared for this war. Instead of blaming himself, instead of blaming his government, Tsar Nicholas II blames the defeats early in World War I on his generals, and in 1916 assumes direct control of his armies. This was a bad move on his part because Russia continues to suffer defeats. And since he is now the direct, in direct control of the army, he can't blame anybody else. And the people can no longer blame other people as well. They have to blame the Tsar. And so his popularity plunges. The people turn against him. The army mutinies. And so in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne. He is replaced in February by a provisional government made up of Russian moderates from the middle class. Now, Russia's middle class is incredibly small. The vast majority of people in Russia are poor peasants. So this government really does not represent the peasantry or represent the vast majority of Russians. And the mistake of the provisional government is that they feel that they must stay in the war. They must stay in the war on the side of the French and the British in order to secure business deals with them after the war. According to their campaign slogan, no peace without victory. The problem is, the Russian people want out of the war. The Russian people want peace. They want food. They don't want high political ideals. They don't want business dealings, international trade deals, and they don't want to continue fighting. So the provisional government not only is not representative of the Russian people, it stands completely against them in terms of what they want. And this opens the doorway for a second revolution that will happen in late October. Now, what's the origins of the October Revolution? Well, the origins of the October Revolution begin with the division of the leftist parties of Russia. The Bolsheviks, which were the Marxian, how would you say, the more radical Marxists of the Russian left, were not the only leftist party. You actually had socialists in Russia called Mensheviks. You also had Marxists that were in favor of the peasants. These were the Socialist Revolutionary Party. However, both the Mensheviks and the SRP took part in the provisional government and supported the war. On the other hand, the Bolsheviks were against the war, but they also took a different tact in building up their party machinery. Before World War I, both the Mensheviks and the SRP were effectively infiltrated and neutered by the Tsarist secret police because they accepted anybody. But the Bolsheviks had an exclusive membership. That meant that if you were going to be a member of the Bolsheviks, you had to know several people who were already members of the Bolsheviks. They just didn't let anybody in. Because Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, this is Vladimir Lenin right here, V.I. Lenin, believed that Marxism could not be brought about in the traditional way Marx talked about. Lenin believed that Marxism in its purest form could not happen in Russia because there was no proletariat. There was no working class in Russia. There was just a peasantry. And unlike the SRP, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, he believed the peasants were incapable and too ignorant to stage a communist revolution. Instead, he argued that you had to have a vanguard party, as he called it, a strong leadership to force the peasants into communism. Now, the combination of believing in a strong, organized political party, combined with the fact that they had effectively avoided being infiltrated by the Tsar's secret police, meant that the Bolsheviks were a much more politically adept political party when the Tsar abdicated. So the real revolution happens in October of 1917. Actually, it culminates in November of 1917, even though it's October in the Russian calendar. Now, how do the Bolsheviks seize control? Well, this starts in October when Bolsheviks start to take control of the Soviets. Now, the Soviets are workers' councils, because when the Tsar abdicates, you remember, the Tsar is the government. The Tsar and his court, when he abdicates, the Russian government starts to collapse. There is a power vacuum in Russia. And into this power vacuum, these workers' councils, or these Soviets, start popping up in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities throughout the Russian Empire. Well, by October of 1917, the Bolsheviks have seized control of these workers' councils, and these workers' councils, even though they're not officially sanctioned, are effectively the governments of these cities. Now, Lenin, who had been living in exile in Geneva, Switzerland, is secretly brought back to Russia, not by the Bolsheviks, but by the Germans during the war. Because, this is 1917. The Germans would like to see Russia knocked out of the war so that, they could turn their full attention against the British and the French. So they put Lenin in a cattle car, of all things. They lock and nail the door shut like they don't want him to escape. They truck him through German-occupied territory, and they let him out right there on the front, just outside of St. Petersburg, which is the nominal capital of Russia at this time. So on October 25th, 1917, the Bolsheviks seize full control of St. Petersburg. The provisional government is forced to flee, and the leader of the provisional government, a fellow by the name of Kerensky, makes it all the way to the United States and finally dies as a small shop owner, I believe in Chicago. The Bolsheviks give the Russian people what they want, at least at first. They get Russia out of the war. They make a very punitive peace with the Germans in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and they promise to give the Russian people what they are needing the most: bread for the workers, land for the peasants. Now, even though in March of 1918, Russia is out of the war between Russia and Germany, does not mean war ends, because even though the Tsar and his family are assassinated by the Bolsheviks in 1918, many monarchists, these are people loyal to the throne of the Tsar, many monarchists and supporters of the liberal provisional government go to war with the Bolsheviks. This Russian Civil War becomes a war between those of the Red Army, which is the Bolshevik-led army, and the so-called White Armies. These are the varied different armies supporting different people. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks have the upper hand in that they have a centralized and unified government and command structure, whereas many of these white armies are not coordinating their operations with each other. So by 1921, the various white armies are either defeated or forced into exile, and the Soviet Union is now secure and declared. And the problem for the Soviets, and for Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union, is that the Soviet economy sucks. And so Lenin institutes what he calls the New Economic Program, or the NEP. The NEP is interesting in the fact that Lenin was a Marxist, but in order to get the economy going, he allows limited capitalism. The major industries of Russia would continue to be owned by the state, so steel mills, transportation, communications, things like that would still be owned by the state. However, regular Russian citizens, Soviet citizens, could have their own small bread shop, or they could sell fruit at a fruit stand, or they could own their own small garden. This was an attempt to get the economy going after the disruption of the First World War and the Russian Civil War. However, Lenin's NEP would only last as long as Lenin was alive. In 1929, Lenin will die, and after a power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky, this is Joseph Stalin, and his main opponent, his main competitor for the position of head of the Soviet Union, was a fellow by the name of Trotsky. Now, Stalin will defeat Trotsky, and Trotsky will be forced into exile. And starting in 1929, Stalin will trash Lenin's new economic program and replace it with what becomes known as his 5-year plan. Now, these 5-year plans are centrally planned economies, basically planning all production, all sales, down to consumer products. It was designed to transform the Soviet Union into a heavily industrialized country overnight. So in these 5-year plans, emphasis for production was given to things like heavy industry, tractor production, hydroelectric dams, steel mills, stuff like that. And almost no emphasis was given to consumer goods. For example, during the first 5-year plan, the Soviets literally made millions of the same style of shoe in the same size, because that was the most efficient way of making it. You don't have any choice, and you must probably have to pray so that your foot fits. Every aspect of the economy was centrally controlled. So there are no private retail outlets. There's no private production. Farming is collectivized. That means there are no private farmers. The state owns farming, and you work on a farm like you would go to work at a factory. You live in communal dormitories. You eat in communal cafeterias. Now, during this time period, Stalin, which actually Stalin is kind of like his code name. His real name is not Stalin. Stalin is Georgian, which Joseph Stalin was a Georgian. He wasn't Russian. Stalin means man of steel. And just like Superman creates a myth around him during this exact same time, Stalin will build a cult of personality around himself. A personality, an image where he is almost godlike. If you go to almost any place in Russia during this time period, you will see portraits of Stalin everywhere. You will see murals painted on school walls, on factory walls, on everything, and they're all subject specific. So if you go to a school, you see Stalin, with all these kids smiling around him. If you go to a factory, you see all these workers working around, and Stalin's holding, a set of blueprints in his hands. If you go to a military base, Stalin is there in the uniform of a general. Stalin is ever present. He's all-knowing, all-seeing. And he gives himself several honors to build this cult of personality. For example, let me read some of these to you because some of them are quite humorous. He is the brilliant genius of humanity, the great architect of communism, the gardener of human happiness, the father of true nations, and the Korikophius of science. I don't know what that actually means. So while Stalin is building this cult of personality, that he is this fatherly figure, in the background he is solidifying his control through what are known as the Great Purges. Stalin will build his totalitarian state by removing all opposition, even opposition within the Communist Party. In 1935, for example, Stalin will purge the party, and in 1938 he will purge the Russian military. Anybody that could pose a threat to his rule, Stalin will basically drum up charges on. He will put them on trial in a kangaroo court and either send them to exile in a labor camp in Siberia or sentence them to death. Now, it's not Stalin doing this himself. This is the sick truth about any totalitarian state. The leader of a totalitarian state cannot do this on their own. They have to have support. They have to have people to help them out. So why do people put up with this? Well, their power is improved. Their power is built up by helping out Stalin. They're able to purge their political enemies. Not just the people on the top, but even people in the lower levels of the party, because if I'm a low-level communist functionary, I can charge my boss with being, you're a monarchist, you're a counter-revolutionary, and guess what? He's gone tomorrow and I'm sitting in his seat. The sick truth of this, though, is that many of the people that help Stalin help out with the initial purges, will wind up being victims of the purges in the end because Stalin sees them as a threat. Now, when Stalin tries to destroy people, when these communists try to destroy people, it's not just that they try and eliminate their authority, either by exiling them or even killing them. They want to erase all aspects of them. So in the Soviet Union, you will see images like this. This is, of course, Joseph Stalin right here. This is the Foreign Secretary, Molotov. And this is the head of what will become the KGB. It's known as the NKVD at this time period. I can't remember the fellow's name offhand, but he is the head of the secret police. And he will help Stalin in the initial purges. However, by the end of the purges of the 1930s, he will be put on trial, found guilty, and put to death. And you will notice that any evidence that he was a close associate of Stalin is airbrushed from this photo. And you got to remember, this is in a time period before Photoshop. You wonder what they could do now. They want to erase all aspects of these people. They want to erase their memory of them. They want to erase them from history. A good case in point of this, a good illustrative example of this is one of my favorite professors who taught that I took the history of Russia from, a fellow by the name of Dr. Brian LaPierre. He actually traveled to Russia because that's where he did his studies from, and he said if you go into the archives there and look at the documents from the Soviet era, you'll find like their Encyclopedia Britannica. And you'll open it up and it looks like a 5-year-old got a hold of it. And he was talking to the archivist and it's like, why are these things cut up the way they are? And this old guy basically said, well, back during the time period, of Brezhnev and Khrushchev when he started out, we would get these pages or parts of pages. And we were told, with instructions, we were told to either cut out the entire page or cut out the entry in that page and paste in this new page. So that, the entry for this fellow right here in, say, their version of Encyclopedia Britannica would have been cut out and replaced with something different, to fill in the gap, erasing this guy from history. To showcase how the Germans tried to erase people from history, this is one reason why they wanted to burn the Jews. They just didn't want to exterminate them. It's one thing just to exterminate them and bury them. They wanted to cremate them. They wanted to erase their identity. They wanted to make them just not, it wasn't enough to just make them non-people. They wanted them not to exist, either in the present or in the past. And so this is the irony of totalitarian movements. That enemy has to be utterly and completely not just destroyed, not just defeated, but eliminated. Now, next class period, we're going to review this. When I say next class period, I mean the class period after you should be watching this. But the next class period after this, we'll run through these slides and answer any questions that you guys might have. But then we're going to jump directly into the beginnings of World War II. I want to thank you guys for sitting through this. Hopefully it's not been too incredibly boring. Again, I've tried to be as lively as I am in class, but it's kind of hard to do that when you're talking to yourself here with nobody else around. It makes you feel like you're going kind of crazy. But I will see you in class and talk to you later. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.